In this lecture, we will cover Chapter 3, the Interorganizational Context of Public Administration. Managers in public organizations, when implementing public policies and managing public programs, they do not work alone, but oftentimes they work and cooperate with different organizations, whether with other public organizations or organizations from the non-profit sector or even from the private sector, in order to successfully and efficiently deliver the goods and services needed by citizens. Working in the public domain and effectively delivering services doesn't usually depend on the work of a single institution, but rather what we call a network of organizations. And this is why we call it the interorganizational networks. Organizations often need to work together towards achieving the objectives of policy. And this is done whether between government organizations, between government and non-profit organizations, government and business organizations. And so in this chapter, we are looking at the types of interactions and the ways in which government organizations deal with different organizations in order to achieve policy goals and implement public programs. Managing public programs requires cooperation between the different levels of government, whether at the national level or at subnational and local levels. Most policies, in order to implement them and to deliver services to citizens, you have to have some cooperation between ministries, for example, at the central government and the organizations that operate, or the departments and public units that operate in the different jurisdictions around the country. And as we mentioned in the previous chapter, that depending on the type of system of a country, you can expect to find different patterns of these intergovernmental relationships. For example, when we mentioned in federal systems, we have different levels of governments with different lawmaking powers, with different authorities over some areas of policies, and so this makes relations between public organizations at these different levels more complicated and require more coordination and more cooperation in order to achieve the general policy objectives of a country. As opposed, for example, to unitary systems where we still have and we still need some sort of cooperation and interaction between the organizations at different levels of government. However, they may not be as complicated as within the federal system, but still some type of cooperation is needed. So take, for example, the education system in Egypt. In Egypt, you have the Ministry of Education in the central level, but also you have the education directorates at in the governorates, and you have an institution that is responsible for the building of education buildings and schools. And so cooperation of all of these institutions is needed in order to achieve a successful education policies, even though education policy at large is set at a central level and we have unified education laws and codes on a national level for the entire country, but still operating the programs, running the schools, making sure that funding is dispersed to all the areas and all the schools and all the buildings are built, requires cooperation, interaction among different organizations around the country. Government organizations are not the only actors in making and implementing public policies and managing public programs. More and more non-profit organizations and private organizations play an increasing role in the process of policy making, and not only in implementing or in delivering services to citizens, but even in the initial processes of raising issues to citizens and putting some of our problems on the agenda of decision makers, and in formulating policies and in affecting or influencing how certain laws and policies are framed and voted on in legislatures, and of course also in the implementation, as governments all over the world are more and more relying on the non-governmental sector or the non-profits and the business organizations in delivering some of the key services to citizens, whether through privatizing some of the services that were previously done by government, or allowing the non-profit or the business sector to enter some of the markets or some of the services that were once only provided by government, or through contracting some of the services to the private sector or to the non-profits. Whatever the method, more and more governments are more relying on working and cooperating with other forms of non-governmental organizations in order to efficiently implement policies and achieve the objectives of policies and programs. And so understanding how we implement policies and how we manage public programs, it is very important to understand the interaction of all of these actors. It's not only the government organizations, but it's also the networks of these government organizations as they work with non-governmental organizations, non-profits, and the private businesses in order to deliver services to citizens. There are many forms in which government organizations can interact with non-profit organizations or the private sector. So generally, when we say privatization, so privatization means that government withdraws from certain types of activities or services that were once done by the government. For example, some countries have privatized the railway systems or have privatized utilities such as water or electricity. These were once services that were offered, so done and managed and offered to citizens by the government, and now they are being shifted completely to the private sector to offer these services directly to citizens in return for fees. Other forms can be, for example, contracting with non-profit organizations or business organizations. So, for example, for providing education systems, so while government may not withdraw completely, but they may contract with NGOs or the private sector to provide education and schooling for citizens in certain areas of the country. The same with healthcare. And sometimes it takes the forms of partnerships where the government and the private sector might jointly work on some services together and have some sort of a contract that runs an agreement between who manages, who delivers the services, how it's being funded, the types of fees that they get. So there are different forms and different ways in which government organizations hires the service of the private sector or the NGOs and involves them in the process of implementing the services to citizens. And as we said, proper management of these public programs in these ways requires efficiently managing the relations and interactions between all of these organizations. But why would government want to privatize some of its services or work with the NGOs or the private sector in delivering services to citizens? So one of the rationale behind privatization is reducing the cost of government. When government works with NGOs or with the private sector, whether by privatizing some of the services or by contracting with them, government essentially is reducing some of its costs, especially the cost of hiring public personnel. So one of the ways is to reduce the number of employees in government by getting services and operating contracts with the private sector or with the NGOs to provide some of the services that government needs or that will deliver services to citizens. So reducing the cost of government is one of the reasons why more and more governments have opted for privatization or contracting with the private sector and non-profit organizations. Another reason is that, especially when it comes to non-governmental groups, there is the idea that clients or citizens are more likely to receive more attention and better care and services from non-governmental groups who usually have a very high concern for citizens and for citizen needs and are usually working around societal benefit and helping citizens. So it is thought that by replacing some of the work that is directly done by government and giving it to the NGOs who work in the local areas, that they might be more attentive to citizen needs, that they might care more about actually delivering the services to the citizens in a better way. And so working with non-profit organizations is seen as a positive in this sense. But also working with the private sector, private firms is usually seen are more efficient in delivering some of the services, and so they operate more efficiently, and so they are likely to provide better services and more efficient services to citizens, especially for the types of services that charge a fee. So for example, by privatizing some of the railway systems and trains or the metro services, it is thought that because private firms work more efficiently, they are likely to reduce their cost, increase their, and be able to use the revenues and use the money that they collect for the fees for the service efficiently, develop the quality of the service, satisfy citizens, and at the same time make a profit from the service, as opposed to government organizations who might have been making losses or subsidizing the service as opposed to running it more efficiently and delivering a good service while making a profit. And another important advantage of privatization is that when government was a sole provider of any good or service, it's usually a monopoly. But when it's offered, when it's privatized and provided to the private sector, the NGOs and non-profits to operate freely in a free market, this enhances competition among the service providers, and so competition will also mean that citizens will benefit because competition among the different service providers is going to raise the quality and reduce the cost for citizens. So this could be a plus. So having a number of or a variety of the service or the goods offered by the private or the non-profit sector is likely to increase competition and give a choice for citizens to choose from of different quality products and at lower prices. So these are some of the benefits of working or running programs or running public programs, not just directly by the public sector, but through a network of work or coordination between the public, the private, and non-profit sector. Despite the many advantages of government working with the private sector or non-governmental organizations for the delivery of services to citizens, there might also be some disadvantages or some of the challenges that public administrators need to be aware of. So one of these challenges is the idea of favoritism, so favoring some companies that may already have some connections or some contracts with the government so that they repeatedly take the government contracts over and over again. And these might also be the larger firms in the market as opposed to the smaller firms that are able to compete for better compete for government programs and take these programs. And so in a sense this could run counter to the idea of opening the market and having a large number of organizations offering the services to citizens in order to increase the quality and lower the costs. And so this is something that public administrators need to be aware of, and to take steps or to have regulations that open up the process for as many organizations as possible and limit this type of favoritism and try to open the space for as many organizations as possible for the benefit of its citizens. Privatization and public-private partnerships can also open the door for many corrupt practices, especially if government officials grant contracts to some organizations without following the legal requirements or without following the rules and regulations put forward in order for bidding for these types of government contracts, or accepting bribes, or taking some benefits from or accepting some gifts or benefits from these private organizations in order to grant them the government contracts. So there should be some strict regulations for public organizations in order to follow regulations and fight such corrupt practices. And finally, when we talk about public programs, usually when government offers a good or a service, government is effectively responsible for the success or failure or for the quality of the service provided. But when we have networks of different organizations providing the service to the citizens, this can create an accountability issue. So it is not easy to determine who is responsible if a particular good or service is not offered effectively and efficiently to the citizens. And so in this regard, we need to think about ways of controlling the work and evaluating the services and being able to pinpoint areas where there are weaknesses so that you can improve the service. So it's not just only about, or it's not as easy as saying whether government has succeeded or failed, but you need to develop mechanisms for evaluating the delivery of the service and being able to improve and being able to monitor how services arrive to citizens so that you can control the quality of the service that citizens get. As nonprofit organizations have become important players in making and implementing public policies and public programs, it is important to look at some of the elements and some of the challenges these organizations face in their work. The first of these elements that is considered critical for successful uh, operation of a nonprofit organization is the capacity to develop operational leadership. And by operational leadership, we mean development of a leadership system that is capable of establishing a mission of a vision for the organization and being able to develop plans so that as to translate those plans and objectives of the organization into real action. So the first uh, mission or the first step of this leadership is to be able to create a clear mission and vision for the organization, and then in the next step being able to actually transform the vision of the organization into a strategic plan. So planning, or the capacity to plan and make work plans and define clear and measurable objectives for the organization, is very critical for the success of the organization. And having this type of leadership that is able to perform these functions is very critical. But it doesn't stop here. Many organizations can have very good vision and mission. They have a very clear guide as to what they want to do, but translating that into action is not that easy. And so the ability to take those plans and those strategies and put them into action is what really defines a good leadership. The second important element of operating a nonprofit organization is resource development, and so the capacity of the organization to raise its resources and gather resources in order to achieve its mission. So as we said, nonprofit organizations are not business organizations. They don't run for profits, and so they have to rely on sources of funding that depends on grants, charitable donations, and funds from people or other organizations, or getting grants from government. And so nonprofit organizations have to be consistently working on developing the resources, making sure that they have sustainable resources to keep them working for the long run. And so this is a challenge, and this requires continuous work, making sure that you can gather or attract volunteers to work for you towards achieving your mission. And so again, the ability to have a clear vision and mission for your organization so that you can articulate it to others and be able to attract volunteers, be able to attract donations for your cause, is a consistent work that nonprofit organizations have to be working on in order to survive and in order to continue to operate successfully and sustainably. The ability to manage the organization's finances is another important and critical element of successfully operating a nonprofit organization. And this is very important because, as we said, nonprofit organizations have to continuously work on developing the resource base, and they have to continuously work on creating funding for their own operations. And so nonprofit organizations, more than any type of organization, really need to properly manage their finances and to keep records of their funding and their expenditures. And this is not only for internal purposes and for successfully managing their operations, but also for communicating with their community, because people who donate money are entitled to know how these organizations are using these funds, so it's a kind of an accountability mechanism for organizations to disclose their funding for their donors and for organizations that fund them. And in many countries, there are usually regulations about financial disclosure for these types of organizations. And so most of these organizations are required to keep records of their funding and funding sources and how they spend them and how much they spend from these funds, for example, on their staff and their administrative operations, as opposed to their actual work and mission and the services they offer to the citizens. And so financial records are an important accountability mechanism so that people can know how their funds that they donate to these nonprofit organizations and spend. And it's also a government mechanism to monitor the operations of these organizations, especially if some of them are also getting grants from government. It's also important to know that some countries, in many countries actually, there are tax breaks that are given to nonprofit organizations because they do services to the community rather than do work for profit. And sometimes their donations or people who make donations to nonprofit organizations are also tax exempt. So when someone makes a donation to an organization, they can be exempted from paying taxes on this amount of money. And so this can also encourage people to donate some of their incomes to NGOs or nonprofit organizations because they can get some tax incentives or tax breaks to do so. Another important element is the board of the nonprofit organizations. These are the members who are responsible for making decisions for the entire organization. And so having an effective governance system or members of the board who are very committed to the organization, who are able to make decisions, who are able to put forward or work with the strategic plan of the organization and direct the organization for achieving its mission is a very critical element of successful organizations. Board members are also the spokespersons of the organization. So usually you would see in many organizations those board members can be public figures, or sometimes they are businessmen who are able to bring in some funding to the organization, or people that people in the community can trust. And so the ability to have an effective board that is committed to the organization is very important. And coordination between them and having a sense of unity in the direction of the organization, that by having people who have the same mission, they have the same goals, are able to have a one direction for the organization as opposed to people having different goals or different ideas is very important. So finally, to sum up, we have seen that public administrators, in doing their work, they no longer just work independently as an organization, but the work of public administrators usually involves working with a large number of external organizations and a complex network of public organizations, NGOs, nonprofit organizations, private organizations, or all working sometimes with different goals and objectives. But the public administrator will have to work with these organizations with the intention of eventually getting his or her work done and being able to deliver the services to citizens that they should deliver for their community. And so This requires not only being able to understand these organizations and their operations, but also develop the skills, especially the interpersonal and the human skills, to deal with these different people and these different organizations, and also to develop the networks and communication, continuous networking and communications with these organizations in order to keep their operations going and to successfully and efficiently deliver the services to their citizens.